I went to art school. I don't regret it, but my 5 years there has led me to many thoughts, feelings, and advice for people considering the same. In this episode, I'm going to talk about why you should go to art school. Don't worry, the follow-up episode will be about the opposite, and we'll see where all of this lands. Greetings, my name is Zach. I'm an artist, and I also taught middle and high school art for 11 years, and yes, I went to art school. I went to a state university and came out with a degree in graphic design and another in art education, the latter of which ran me through the gauntlet of studio classes, everything from drawing to metalsmithing to photography to typography. My personal experience here is obviously based on what I experienced at art school, but also on students that I taught who then went on to art school, professionals I know or have as friends, much online research, and also just the perspective of being 14 years out of college at this point. So let's start off with a slew of great reasons why you should potentially go to art school. Right out of the gate, I want to start with the breadth of subjects. One of the most beneficial things for me was related to how many different subject matters I had to take. For all art students at the state university, you had to take a few basic courses in art history, 2D, painting, and 3D. As I was specialized in graphic design, I took more specific classes in that realm, such as typography and illustration, and the education program had a slew of others to ensure well-roundedness. In the end, I took many studio classes I would have glossed over, and my art, my teaching, and my soul benefited from these. As someone who spent most of their time focused on drawing mediums, with the potential exception of acrylic painting here and there, having to delve into things like sculpture and ceramics was really good for me in a lot of ways. Sculpture was my introduction to a pass-fail system, which was a lovely idea and concept at the moment that I started, but as I got into the class, I realized the sheer terror of wondering the entire semester whether you were passing or failing. But sculpture allowed me to start thinking about things in 3 dimensions. And this is obvious. There's a reason why a lot of the online instructors now work with things like ZBrush, why Proco has lots of classes that actually work with 3-dimensional sculpture in the finite reality realm. But it really does do something different for your mind when you start to process things in 3 dimensions. Now, my freshman sculpture class, which was Intro to 3D, basically we had all of these weird projects where we had to illustrate sound or a song, where we had to build shoes that would raise us 12 inches off the ground. A lot of just kind of basic, almost more craft-based projects. But the upper division sculpture class was focused far more on form and on texture. And for someone who had spent so much of his time working in 2D, working with pen and pencil, having to try to think about the other side of the thing you're working on, or just the bottom of it, there were all these angles and these processes that were foreign to me. Sculpture put me in a realm where I was just exposed to things I would think about, wouldn't think about in any particular way, and this would allow me to process them differently. Now, when we moved down that 3D train to something like ceramics was very, very difficult for me. It was really beneficial because it taught me a lot of humility, because I hadn't encountered an artistic medium that really kicked me in the gut like ceramics did. Fight as I may the entire semester, I could never quite figure out how to do it with any kind of efficiency, and any time that I succeeded, I always felt like it was mostly by sheer luck. And so ceramics was good for me in that it taught me that this is how some people see the art mediums that come naturally to me. So drawing, and to a lesser degree painting, always came much more naturally to me. And when I had people in my classes who were struggling or who weren't doing quite as well, I just kind of had that natural, arrogant assumption that, well, they're just not trying very hard, or I'm just better than them. In a ceramics class where I was clearly in the lower 50% of the achievers in that realm, was humbling for me and unpleasant. I didn't like it. But often I find humbling things are not particularly pleasant for us to endure. So again, these 2 3-dimensional realms are really, really good. And if you are jumping into an art school, whether it's a state school or otherwise, you're often going to have a lot of different art classes you have to take. And if you start working with 3-dimensional things, even on ZBrush or on a computer, it's still going to apply a lot of these same facets. So this well-roundedness is really beneficial. Moving on from there, I also had to take photography classes. And photography was another realm that was fairly difficult for me and was humility-inducing. I, as a graphic designer, had a tendency to center things, had a tendency to emphasize things compositionally in a way that has actually been very, very difficult for me to work on. Even now, when I work on large-scale pieces and paintings, I struggle to get my composition to be interesting and intriguing. And that's because I like to center things. I like things to work as if they were logo or logotype. And photography ran me through the ringer because photography is totally different. You're almost entirely focusing on composition and how you arrange all of the items. I like to focus on detail and interesting lines and things, and I think it was one of the first classes where I got some lower marks, some lower grades, and I had to talk to my instructor a lot, and he was able to tell from my first set of photographs that I was a graphic designer. He looked at them and then looked back at me almost sadly and went, "You're a designer, aren't you?" And I went, "Yeah, but now I'm kind of terrified to know why you know that from looking at my photographs." And again, he was able to point me in the right direction and help me to understand that this is a different artistic media. I had come from the background of photographers they're lazy. They're not as talented as artists or as painters and drawers. They don't put as much time and energy in. And I had to learn that that's just not the case, that it's a different artistic medium. And again, this is not arrogant, 36-year-old Zach. This is, 18, 19, 20-year-old Zach when I was young and stupid. And it took a little bit of time in that class to realize that the people that were really good photographers were not people who just strolled up and took a single photo and were awesome. They usually took a slew of photos, but they'd also had to spend so much time thinking about, processing, and conceptualizing exactly how they were going to handle those compositions before they ever got there. So photography is a wonderful thing to do, and if you get an opportunity to do that when you go to art school, it will be a wonderful addition to your compositional understanding, regardless of what media it is that you really, really want to focus on. Photography extends how your mind thinks about things, and if you're like me, where you like to design and you like to draw and work in that realm, working on something like photography will be good and humbling potentially for you. Hopefully not in the same realm that it was for me. Now, I also did have drawing and painting classes, and they were largely, I think, what most of you would expect. Most of the drawing classes at the freshman level were classes that focused on value, on line, on the structure of drawing. Most of the work was with charcoal and with pencil and pen. The freshman class was taught by a grad student in my experience, and at state schools that happens a lot. At an art-specific school, it's going to be better. You're going to have an instructor who's going to be able to do a little bit better job there. But the drawing classes at the lower levels were largely just focused on teaching you how to work with value and how to work with line. So many of us learn how to draw by focusing on the outlines and the contour. And so a lot of the exercises are built to stretch that, to take you to a point where you're thinking about the value structure of a thing and not necessarily just the lines. And a lot of this was done via still life and very difficult still lifes, where sometimes the still life would be a whole bunch of sheets over boxes, so everything's the same tone. Or the still life might be a whole bunch of bottles that are partially transparent, or the side of a couch with a whole bunch of threads and things on it. These were done specifically and purposefully to help us not think about contour and outlines, but to focus on thinking about the value and the texture and the implied texture of a thing as we worked on it. As the drawing classes evolved and I started taking higher division drawing classes, they started to become a little bit more theoretical. At this point, we were allowed to introduce things like collage. Watercolor came in a larger capacity. Pens and ink and other things that weren't necessarily tools that were not frowned upon, but they were things that weren't included a lot in the lower classes, could become part of what we were doing. Because so much of what we were doing was just simply based on the concept or idea. And so at this point, the classes were largely based on, okay, here's the idea. You need to represent something that is small, that has become large, and you need to show scale in this piece. Famously, there was a piece that I had to do in one of my upper division drawing classes where the professor walked in and just put a chair on a table and he said, your project is to draw this chair, but you can't draw the chair. You have to draw the chairness of the chair, the platonic ideal of the chair. And we all kind of just sat there and scratched our head for a while trying to figure out, like, what the heck does that mean? How do we do this? And in turn, we really had to think about, like, well, what makes a chair a chair? Was that project really good for my drawing skills? maybe not, but what it did was it opened my mind to the concepts and the ideas of project building, which in turn I used a lot in my teaching, and I made my students have to suffer through this same project for years. And it would, oh man, it was such a fun project to introduce, just because I got to see all the faces of my students go like, I have no idea what this means. Like, what the heck are you doing to me, Feldman? So that was enjoyable in its own right, though. Whether it was kind or not, So the drawing classes, by and large, were good and were solid. And again, this is at a state school, but they did a good job with them. Painting classes, probably the best professor that I had at the university was my freshman painting instructor. And he did a lot of the same things that you'll run into if you are looking at any collegiate painting instructor, or if you're looking at anybody on YouTube who's walking you through how to paint. A lot of what they talk about is breaking things down into shapes, working from large to small, working from light to dark or dark to light, but just having a decision that you're making there. I learned a lot of very good base level lessons from this guy. He did a really good job of walking us through things. He was stern as the day is long. He was a little bit like the stereotypical art instructor that you think of. There was yelling, there was cursing, there was, not from me, but there were definitely tears in that class. He was very harsh. But his goal was to help everyone improve, and I think he'd probably just had enough time of working with young kids where he knew a lot of people came in arrogant and hot, and a lot of people just didn't have what it took, and he wanted to kind of get people to get to the understanding early that this is not easy, this is going to be difficult, and you can't hack it, then you should probably get out. Harsh for 18-year-olds. But I appreciate a lot of what I got from him. I learned a lot about painting. Probably 50% of what I've learned about painting in the last 20 years has been from that one man. And he was just a lovely individual. As I got up into the oil painting classes, specifically in the senior and junior years, again, like I saw in the drawing class, the concepts became, well, just that, more conceptual. They became less specific of like, this is exactly what we're doing. There was a lot less instruction, which I didn't appreciate. I would have liked a lot more actual instruction. And again, if you go to an art school specifically, not just a normal state university that has an art program, you will presumably have better instructors in that capacity. But what I found was a lot of the instructors that I ran into at the upper levels were people that worked in the profession. They were professional painters, professional printmakers, whatever it might be. And they also then taught at the university. So, and that's one of the big things that you're going to run into at a university is, and maybe at just any art school in general, is you don't have to know how to teach to end up being a teacher. You know, a lot of my instructors had never taken a class on how to teach. Some people have it naturally, and that's great, but there was a lot that I learned in my art education program that was fantastic and really helped me succeed in teaching. A lot of that has to do with understanding how much material a person can swallow in any given time, how to encourage people and lead them when what it feels like to them is the Sisyphean task of pushing a boulder up a hill forever and never succeeding. And so you've got to give students the ability to succeed on small things so that they actually will stay with you to get through the tougher things. So but I saw the same things in my painting classes. As I got older and experienced the higher level painting classes, they were more conceptual, there was less instruction. One of my professors told me at one point that I would get a better grade if I included purple in my paintings because he liked purple a lot. So it was a fun class. I definitely had a student in that class who worked beside me, who by the end of the class was so fed up, he just started turning everything we did into robots. So we'd be working on these large still lifes and he would just make everything into a robot. There was also a girl who worked a couple easels behind me. I don't know what was going on exactly, but she was not seeing the same colors I was seeing. And yeah, it was always interesting to look at her easel and her canvas and see what was coming out of that interesting mind. The graphic design classes were actually pretty fantastic at the base level. Again, it was a grad student teaching my first graphic design class, and she was phenomenal. She had been in the industry, and she did a really good job of walking us through things and helping us understand. We had to do everything in pencil first before we were allowed to use the computer, which is great because it forced us to draw letters perfectly. It forced us to use lots of stencils and things to get perfect circles. And it taught us that a lot of what you would do on a computer you can do in a sketchbook, and sometimes you can thumbnail and sketchbook things out much more efficiently and much faster. So the baseline classes were great. They ran us through all kinds of things and taught us a lot of just the basics of design and how it functioned. And a lot of our projects just focused on the principles and elements of design, which is a really good place to start when it comes to graphic design. As the courses went up, I had to take 2 levels of typography and 2 levels of illustration. And those classes were big, just in scale. And frequently you would have 1 or 2 projects over the course of the entire semester. And those projects were based on a particular prompt, and you would develop a company or develop a candidate or a political platform. And then that would be what you would build all of your material for that entire class. I don't know if this is how it is often at other graphic design institutions, but what it did was it made you work with boring things and it made you work with exciting things. And you were stuck with that logo and the stuff that you designed from early on forever. And so when he required us to have 50 thumbnails minimum before we took any steps on any logo design, I was really frustrated by that. But looking back later, I understand that was reasonable. It was reasonable for him to expect so many iterations and so many thumbnails from us. And that started me on the path of when I was teaching, I often had my students, almost always had my students, do at least 3 thumbnails for me, 3 sketches before they started a project. And the reason is that the idea that's in your brain initially that you put down on paper is very rarely, in my experience, the best one. It's just the idea that your brain is held on to, and it's often not even thought through that well. But usually the second or third idea will become much better than whatever that first idea was. And so that's something that I adopted. It's something I use in my work now. Even the piece that you're seeing play out in the background here is I have dozens of sketches of this valley and this field and this tower and how it operates and how it functions and what the people there would need to eat and how the architecture would function. All of these things come from that like almost meditative immensity of thumbnailing and planning prior to jumping into something. Those classes were pretty similar, like the typography and illustration. I think I took the same gentleman for all 4 of those classes that I had to do. And they were pretty similar every round. I know some of the other instructors did things that were a little bit different, but predominantly it was just you were working on making posters, logos, business cards, brochures, websites, all of the kind of stuff that you would do in a normal, traditional graphic design arena. Nowadays, I think that's probably shifted. There's probably a lot more of that goes online. And, talking to my wife, who works in marketing, about what some of their graphic designers have done over the years, it is a lot of the design jobs work with things that are social media related. You see it on YouTube with thumbnails. You see it on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on a lot of those platforms. There are individualized ways that graphic design is applied. So it exists in all of the same ways that I learned, but it also exists now in a lot of other ways. And graphic design is probably for the foreseeable future going to be something that is going to be required in most businesses. Unless, of course, AI art takes that over completely, because it might be one of the things that is easiest for AI art to work with. But we'll see, because as of right now, it seems like it might be harder to get a copyright on something that's devised entirely by AI, and that's not going to be good for you and your company if you can't copyright your logo. So we'll see how all of that plays out. But the breadth of all of the subjects that I had to learn was I was going to say hugely and then immensely at the same time. It was immensely beneficial to me. I had to do a lot of things I wouldn't have done had I had complete control of what I was doing. I learned a lot of things about my own art, how I approach it, how others approach art, my areas of weakness, my areas of strength. The breadth of all the subjects was hugely beneficial to me, and I got a ton out of it. So that would be one of the best aspects about going to art school. And one of the things that I think you're going to have trouble if you don't go to art school, recreating that on your own. So breadth of subjects, hugely important. There, I managed to get in both words. This next section is about well-roundedness, about general education classes. So if you are only considering going to a school that is specifically for art, where you won't have any other subjects, then I would go ahead and skip ahead. to the next chapter, the next section of this podcast. Though not as focused as an educational program only tailored toward art, many art programs, especially those at a state university or school, will offer other classes traditionally associated with what many of you experienced in high school. A lot of the courses that you have to take, maybe upwards of 50% of the courses that you have to take at a state school or university, are not going to be art classes only. You're going to have writing classes, you're going to have speech classes, math classes, science classes, history classes, general education classes, random classes that make no sense and don't tie into anything but are fun and maybe one of your friends is taking them. So there's a lot of benefits to all those things. Obviously, you're going to meet a lot of people and a lot of different kinds of people when you take classes that are outside of the art realm. And we'll get into community next, actually. But you're going to get a chance here to explore things that you wouldn't necessarily have elsewhere. If you're in a school that's only focused on the culinary arts or only focused on drawing or painting, then you're not going to be taking classes with engineers. You're not going to be taking potentially engineering classes or programming classes. You're not necessarily going to get more American or Eastern history classes or philosophy classes. And all of those things are good for us as human beings. They open us up. They show us more ideas, more concepts, and it is one of the biggest pitches you can make for going to college in general. Though I've got a lot of feelings about going to college in general these days, which maybe I'll talk about in a future podcast, as this one's specifically for art. But not everybody ought to go to college. But this is one of the biggest benefits, is that you just get this breadth of material that you get to go through. I think fundamentally the biggest one, though, is writing, talking, and working in areas that you're less comfortable with. I think those three things are things that the general ed classes, the well-roundedness, really benefits from. So, or benefits to, which also doesn't make sense, but that's fine. So, writing. A lot of classes that you have elsewhere outside of the art realm are going to focus on you writing and communicating things. So if your goal is to go into art professionally, to make a career that way, the chance that you're going to be able to get away without doing any kind of writing and communicating in written form is pretty much zero. You are going to be an entrepreneur who works for yourself if you are going to be an artist. Unless you're very lucky and you start working at some kind of business or an art house or a studio, in which case you're still going to have adequate writing skills to even get in the door, and you're going to be responding to emails and having things back and forth with colleagues. So focusing on your writing skills and working to improve those is one of the benefits that is just going to come naturally from being at a university or a college. This is a really important thing. I had to write all kinds of essays, especially for my education program. The two teacher work samples I had to do at the end were tremendous. They were each right around 100 pages, which is not what most people are going to have to do in college unless you do a master's degree. But having to put those kinds of documents together was lovely when I worked in administration in the schools, and it was lovely when I was teaching because I had spent enough time working on categorizing things and writing efficiency that things of scale were no longer as daunting for me. We can all work on becoming more proficient with our writing skills and become better at communicating in general. Especially as we continue to move forward into a social media and internet-dominated society, the ability to communicate adequately is just absolutely fundamental. On that same train of thought, talking, discussing, and critiquing are all benefits. The critiquing and the discussing are going to be things that specifically come from the art education as well. So this ties into both sides. But learning how to communicate with people in discussions in small groups, learning to work alongside people and with people, all of these things are things that are going to continue to be amplified and honed by putting time into an art school or, you know, a state school or university that has some art programs. So obviously you're going to have to take speech classes, and anytime you're working on art, it seems like you always have critiques and presentations and discussions. Especially in the graphic design class, every single time we finished a piece, we'd have to present it, we'd have a discussion and critique. And it was really good just learning human dynamics and how all of us interact. And was it uncomfortable? Of course it was uncomfortable. I don't feel like most of us like putting our art on display and having to defend it and talk about it. But talking, discussing, and working together, learning how to work with other human beings is just such a fundamental skill here in the United States, as a human, as a creature with a soul, however you want to slice it. So the skills that you continue to hone and work on in a school of some kind is going to continue to help you become better at discussing, better at working with other people. Another advantage here too is if you're going to a school that isn't entirely made up of art students, you're going to be talking and discussing things with people who are fundamentally different than you. And this is going to happen in any school, but it happens a lot when you've got, kids from an art college who are also taking classes with engineers or philosophy majors. Talking and discussing and learning how to work with people that are very, very different than you, that have different political views, different religious views, they are of different ethnicities, all of these things. It's good for us as humans to be exposed to all those things. It helps us understand the world and other humans in a better way, and it also helps us to understand our beliefs, thoughts, and ideas, and if they actually hold water. And university and college are going to naturally do this. You are going to run up against people who have different ideas and philosophies than you. And I find that for myself and for most adults who went to college or school at some point, this is also a beneficial thing to them, that they spent time defending their positions and calcifying the good ones, and in some cases getting rid of the bad ones. So learning how to talk and discuss with other people is going to be a really lovely benefit of being at an art school. The last thing here for the well-roundedness, because I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about the wonder and beauty and benefits of learning history and science and math, which I could do a whole thing on that. And if you want that, just leave that in the comments. But I'm not going to focus on that here. I'm going to focus really quickly, though, on just working in areas you're not comfortable with. And I talked about this with ceramics and photography specifically, but you're going to become more well-rounded when you work in areas that you are not experienced in and you are not comfortable in. If you are an artist and you're going to art school, but you're going to have to take some math classes and science classes, it's going to be good for you as a human being. Is it going to be pleasant? Probably not. But working in areas that you're not comfortable in is going to be something that comes in most workplaces you are going to be. Whether you work in the arts or anything else, pieces of your life are going to be saturated with things that are uncomfortable. And so if you're young and you're going to art school and you're running into these things, it's good to get systems developed at a young age for how you personally deal with these things. At some point you're going to run into these things that you're super uncomfortable with. And if you just default to something, you might be okay. But as you go to school and you're forced into these situations, it'll allow you to develop systems for handling yourself when you run into situations that make you uncomfortable, when you run into things that you are unaware of, when you run into new situations. It's good as a person to have those strategies, to have ideas about what you can do and how you handle yourself, and to know just how you respond when you're in those situations. So again, the well-roundedness, the being exposed to things outside of art is super beneficial for pretty much anyone who goes to school. And yeah. Another benefit of going to art school and really just college in general is community. It's hard to overstate the importance of community. When we're in middle school or high school, this kind of happens naturally. You've got people around you. You've got friends, or you have the ability at least to make friends. People who do the same things as you, people who can help you along that journey, people who can help bear the burden when things are difficult. Now, if you finish high school and you don't go into school, you might still continue to have this community in the form of the workforce. Even if you went and worked at a place like King Soopers or Target or Walmart or whatever your giant box store, your favorite giant box store locally to you would be, you're still going to have some community there. Your community is going to be obviously a mixed bag of things because you're not going to have people that are only your own age there. You're going to have potentially people that are much younger than you, people that are much older than you, people from very different demographics, and that can be beneficial. But the community that you get when you go to school, especially art school, is different. Now, when I went to art school, a lot of the community that I had was very familiar to me. I spent a lot of time in high school playing in punk bands and ska bands, and so you had that kind of rebellious teenage angst and attitude that came along with a lot of the kids who are also gamers, a lot of the kids who are the anime nerds. That kind of whole group coalesced into this thing. And I found that a lot of those people were the same kind of humans that I had art school with. So there were lots of people with tattoos, even coming straight into college, lots of piercings, lots of different lifestyles and different kinds of attire. So it was really cool. You know, there were a lot of skateboarders and whatnot. Like I skateboarded to class for the first 2 years of school. So that kind of community was really comfortable to me because I ran into a lot of the same kinds of people that I had gone to high school with and that I hung out with. But I forged a lot of new friendships, and I ran into a lot of people that were from different places in the country, from different backgrounds, had different relationships with their families or religion and things like that. And all of that was beneficial to me. Not only did it open my mind up, like I mentioned earlier, it also just allowed me to have friends and inputs from all these different pieces. I'm not sure how I would have made it through art school without friends. I lament that I've lost touch of a lot of them. I didn't stay in contact with most of my friends that I made in college. And I think that's a mistake. Looking back now, I would have tried to stay in contact with a lot of the people, especially that I went through the education program with or the graphic design program with. A lot of those people were super helpful. We stayed up late, we worked on projects together, we helped each other through things. But I kind of moved straight into the workforce as soon as I got out of college, and I had this nasty tendency to just devote myself to what I was working on at that time. I got married right out of college and spent a year doing landscaping work and then went straight into starting a school. And that's a lot of intense, very time-consuming things. And my regret and my mistake in that time period was not maintaining my communication with the community that I had formed. So the ideas that you develop when you have other people around and you see what they're doing is really substantial as well. So if you're working at home in your basement or in your room on your art projects, you are going to be exposed to the stuff that you purposefully expose yourself to online. However, when you are sitting in a classroom, you don't have any control of what you're exposed to. You could have 5 or 10 students that all work on the exact same still life, but then you see one kid off in the corner. And it's, where did you pull that color from? How did you get that idea? Those kinds of moments are important. They're things that happen really naturally in high school, but they're things that you have to either artificially construct or you have to get through classes when you get older. So I think that that's a huge benefit to the community, is not only do you have well, let's just go into those too. The other benefits of the community is you have like-minded people around you. You have people who are doing the same things you are, who are enduring the same struggles you are, people that understand you. And this is super, super important, especially for something like art, where art is a little bit niche and not a lot of people have exposure to it. And we get a lot of parents and people in our lives that are very well-meaning that try to talk us out of pursuing anything artistically. When you're in an artistic community like you run into at an art school or an art college, you've got people who are in that same boat. So you can all kind of help each other lash the raft together, as it were, and maintain the course and continue to do what you're doing. So that community is super beneficial. And I think this probably extends for most career paths, but maybe more so for creative things, because our culture and our community here in the US is kind of accidentally opposed to the creative realms. It's not secure, it's not reliable, it's not consistent in the same way that other jobs are, at least from the outside, and maybe it truly isn't. I know that for a lot of artists, it's a long, long road in order to actually make a living of it, and a lot of people just end up having it as a hobby. But again, when you're going to school, if you choose to go to art school, you're going to get a lot of experiences and a lot of community built up over that time period that is going to be beneficial for you for the rest of your life. These are potentially friends that you hold on to, but even if you don't, you're holding on to the strategies, you're holding on to that sense of community. You know what that community feels like, you know how to build it later on, you know how to find it, and you know exactly what you're looking for. So the community of art school is just wonderful. The camaraderie and the feeling like you belong. Because so many of us as artists kind of have this, I don't fit in, I'm different. And that was part of the reason why I ended up in the punk and ska bands, is that whole subgenre of music, especially back when I was in school, was built of people who didn't feel like they belonged. You know, what were all the gamers? What were all the anime nerds? They were all people who felt like they didn't belong. Now, gaming has become a lot more, I don't know if I would say mainstream, but kind of more mainstream in the last decade or so. But again, I was in high school 20 years ago, and things were a little different. You know, a lot of kids weren't allowed to play video games, or would like come to our Halo nights and Halo parties and like tell their parents they were doing something else because they weren't allowed to play video games, or they were only allowed to play very specific video games. It's become a little bit more acceptable, I suppose, as people like myself and people like my father, who grew up playing a lot of video games as well, raised kids, and either they saw it as not being a negative thing, or they had to justify their own video game habits, and so they've let their children do it. So my daughter's only 4, so I don't let her play any video games yet, but I have started looking at the possibility of getting her a Switch in the next year or two, especially because her favorite color right now is yellow, and they make a little Switch Lite that's yellow and super cute. But as soon as she's got the fine motor skills, I'll probably start playing, you know, really simple kids games with her, and that'll be a lot of fun. I still remember playing video games when I think I was 5 and 6 with my father growing up, and it was a lot of fun. I have a lot of good memories there. So, community, huge, huge beneficial aspect of going to art school. Another piece that I really don't want to skim over is the commitment of going to art school. When you decide that this is what you're going to do, you have a lot of money, a lot of financial burdens that are accompanying it. And when you have money attached to something, it's often easier to stay committed. When you're paying for something, it becomes more important to you because hopefully you've already justified that it is worth that cost, and you're not just hoping that it will be someday. If that's you, I would strongly urge you to reconsider, because you really want to make sure that whatever you're purchasing, and remember, education is a purchase, that it is worth your time. And in this case, it's going to be worth your time as in it's going to get you the skills that you want to move forward. It's going to be enjoyable enough. You're going to build the community and the future connections that are going to allow you to do something. Whatever it is, it has to be worth it. It is a purchase. But also, once you're committed and there, you've paid the money, you are going to meet professors and teachers in person. You're going to make friends and have classmates in person. And when you have those faces attached to these human beings, it's easier to show up and do the work. You have people in your mind that you don't want to let down, and it creates some accountability there. So the commitment of art school is, for some people, probably the reason that they do it. I have one interaction that I'm thinking of in an upper division drawing class where I was frustrated at one point with how much the class was costing me. And one of the students in the class scoffed, and he said, well, like, the reality is, if we don't pay this money and show up to these classes, do you really think we're going to sit at home and do the work? And I hated that explanation. It made me mad. Partially because it's totally not true. That there's no reason why we had to be showing up to that class that day. Like, we could have all been sitting at home paying nothing for a class and working on those skills and looking things up. But the other part of it is, there was a grain of truth to that. That most of us as students at 18, 19, 20 years old, we're probably not going to actually hold ourselves accountable and work really, really hard at home. So we were working harder because we were in that class and we were paying that money. And that money was creating that commitment for us. So I hate that statement. I still do, but I think there is some truth to it. That when you put your money forward, that you are committed and you don't want to waste that time and you don't want to waste that money. And so you're going to have a tendency to work harder on things. Now, as a bit of a caveat, that I'll do this more in the next video, but you obviously could pay for classes and not go to art school, pay for classes online and things, and you're going to have that same accountability and commitment. But I have found personally, and I know this for other people as well, that it's the human connection that really pulls you through. I have classes I purchased and have not finished yet. And part of that is the fact that there's no need to show up and do it on a daily or weekly basis. However, the classes that I purchased that I have to show up for in person, or even if it's online, right? I've taken several of Marshall Vandriff's classes, and I didn't miss a session, and I did lots of notes, and most of the time I did the work, even though I was teaching full-time when I was doing those, and it was sometimes difficult. So that's another very big benefit. We're going to have a couple here at the end that are going to be a little bit more freestyle and a little bit more quick. I've covered some of what I think are the biggest categories, at least for now in this podcast, but we're going to go through another set that are really beneficial here in just the next couple minutes. So one is the connections for future work. So obviously, if you're going to school with a whole bunch of other artists, a lot of them probably aren't going to go into any industry. They're just going to have the degree, like most people in the US do when they finish a degree. They don't go into that field of work. The degree just helps them get into something. But some of them inevitably will be working in the industry. So if you go and get a drawing degree, or you focus on drawing, there's a good chance that some of those people are going to end up as draftsmen, as architects, as tattoo artists. If you go to a concept art school specifically, they might be people that actually get into the industry that you're wanting to get into, and you have personal connections with them. So this goes a little bit back to the community, but the connections for future work are super important. And really, you only need one connection most of the time. So whilst it's not good to form relationships based on the fact that those people might benefit you in the future, the reality is that being at art school is going to forge connections, and you're going to have the potential of, oh, this guy works in this girl works in this, and then I can get a hold of them, they can put in a good word for me, and sometimes that's all that it takes. Okay, another one is if cost is no issue, either you are going to be able to get scholarships, your parents are going to be able to pay for it, your grandparents put away a whole bunch of money so you can go to school, then I think it's kind of a no-brainer. Take a couple years of your life to mentally mature, let your brain finally hit, its later stages of development and maturity. You get to spend time with a whole bunch of like-minded people. It's wonderful. So if money is not an issue, I think, and you really want to go into the arts, I think that going to art school would be a lovely idea. That's just, it's not most people's circumstances, but if that is you specifically, then I think that it's probably a good idea. So yeah, that's, again, not going to be most people, but if that's you, that's probably not a bad thing. This is an kind of a weird one, but it might work for you in particular. It can be an answer for what are you doing with your life. So often when you finish high school and you start moving through what people condescendingly call the real world, if you can tell someone, like, I'm going to school right now, that does answer that question. So if you're one of those people who feels a little insecure about what you're doing with your life, sometimes being able to give them that response is satisfying to them. It's satisfying to you as well. The reality is all of us need some time to figure out who we are and what we're going to do and what we want to do with our existence. It's easy when you're young to think you know exactly where you're going to go, and I'm sorry, but it's just almost never the case. I feel like having taught over 1,000 students in middle and high school over the 11 years that I was at the school, I probably had fewer than a dozen students that I met when they were in middle or high school that knew what they were going to do and then did it. Very, very, very few people stuck to their initial plans or thoughts or observations about themselves. But this can be an answer to that question. So I don't think, if that's the only reason you're going to art school, it's a terrible reason. But if it's an augmentation to some other reasons, then it might not be a bad thing for you. Another one is having the mentors in person. This just kind of piggybacks on everything else that I've spoken about. But having actual mentors in person that can bust your chops or help you with things or encourage you or walk you through stuff, it's so much easier for somebody when they're with you to point out what's wrong or what's right in one of your pieces. So having the mentors in person is a huge beneficial aspect. Yes, you can get this in other capacities, but it's probably the easiest to get when you go to art school. The last one here I want to talk about is just that going to college, if it's not a huge financial burden, is a good stage of life. I'm sure many of us have had people in our lives who've talked about their glory days, the time that they spent in college, and they talk about it as being the best time of their life. And I think there is some of the rose-colored glasses coming into effect there, but there's also just the reality that for a lot of people, those formative years in college, being away from home for the first time, living on your own, getting to make your own decisions, is a wonderful time. And so if it's not a huge financial burden for you, I think that getting out and going to school, getting away from what your reality has been, challenging your thoughts and forging your own solidified opinions about who you are and what the world is, can be a really good and beneficial thing. So college itself, whether it's art-related or otherwise, can be really beneficial in that realm. And that might be something that I talk about on its own in another podcast, so if you'd like to hear that, just go ahead and put that in the comments below. And that is going to wrap up this episode of the podcast, episode 7. Episode 8, like I mentioned at the beginning of this one, will be delving into why you shouldn't go to art school. And so my perspective on this is going to be a nuanced, weird amalgamation of these two entire podcasts. Because depending on who you are, your financial status, what you want, my opinion would be different. And as I don't have the ability to interact with all of you personally who are talking to me here, then I have to give kind of the large scope of things. And I hope that if you are thinking about going to art school, that you'll listen to both of these podcasts and that you will solidify your position and have a good understanding of what you're going to do and what you think is best for your particular situation. So thank you for tuning in. If you liked the video, please like. If you are not subscribed, I would very much appreciate the subscribe. It helps the channel out a ton and it gives me feedback on what I'm doing. On that same train of thought, I know I've mentioned several times throughout the video that you can leave some comments below, but I would really appreciate that as well on what's going well with these podcasts and maybe content that you'd like to see in the future. So thank you guys. I appreciate you listening all the way through. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.